permission to call you Ajay MK. Yeah, I'm really, I met Ajay a few weeks ago virtually, and I was just really inspired about his approach to diversity and inclusion and how he marries data impact with psychology and neuroscience. And it's such an interesting approach. So I'm really excited for this keynote address. Ajay, for those who don't know, is the group head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at John Swire and Sons Limited. He has significant HR leadership and board experience at multinational companies such as Colgate, Palmolive, and Swire, and has served in leadership roles based in Hong Kong, the US, India, and Southeast Asia. As the group head of DE&I at John Swire & Sons, he supports a holistic data and insight-based approach for driving business and people impact through inclusion. Ajay is academically trained in commerce, psychology, and management. And he's an accomplished poet as well, whose works have been translated into multiple European and Asian languages. Ajay, I'd love to invite you for the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you, Saranta. Am I clear to those who are online? And hopefully I'm standing in a place where I'm visible to everybody. Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I would say Saranta has now raised the expectation, so I'm under some bit of pressure. I haven't prepared slides because what I thought is share with you a few points or messages that I have in my mind, and then spend some time maybe responding to any questions that you have. So what I first want to say is, and I think Janet has made it easier, the first thing I would say is, I think DEI, as I knew it, has changed in the last few months. So my own professional journey with DEI has always been, DEI has been one of the things which I was responsible for in a career where most of my roles have been chief HR officer roles and board roles, and I've always had a DEI person within my team. And the DEI, the flavor of DEI, which I saw from 2012, 2013, which was the beginning of DEI in the United States, to what we are now seeing, I think there is a real change, and I'll talk about it in a bit. And I think it's important to pay attention to why this change is happening. So let me first share with you my hypothesis. I'm very interested in geopolitics. I'm very interested in economics, having lived in many parts of the world. But as someone who grew up in a very small village in rural India, I see myself as someone who lives in different worlds or different realities. One of the reality which is set in, especially if I think about Asia or some of the Asian countries, around Asia and perhaps around the world, I think there is a greater disillusionment with globalization. There is a greater disillusionment with capitalism. It is almost like people everywhere become a bit cynical about this force which was supposed to be a force for good. In the 80s, if you remember those buoyant days, whether you were in China or India, everybody wanted liberalization, globalization. Now you see a rise in populism everywhere. Okay, I don't have to mention the countries, but look around. There is a reason why right-wing political leaders are becoming dominant in most societies, most countries, because for suddenly we have lost our abundance mentality, and every country is now worrying about resources, about what they could lose. So there is a scarcity mentality that is set in. With populism, I think countries and societies are beginning to build a barrier and closing themselves from other countries. So all of a sudden, we are less of one global Homo sapiens family, and we're all beginning to think of ourselves as Indians and Chinese and Americans and whatnot. So it then consequently, if that hypothesis is right, it's not surprising that there is a pushback on DEI. Because what does DEI say? DEI is really about embracing everybody. So this is the first thing I want to put forth to you, and it's important to see this trigger. Secondly, linked to the pressure that comes from the, I wouldn't want to say collapse of globalization, but skepticism of globalization. A lot of corporations, commercial corporations, are facing margin crunch. They are losing access to markets, access to supply chains. A lot of you might be in industry which may be moving supply chain as we speak from China to somewhere else, for example. So all of this is suddenly making boards and senior management begin to ask that dreaded three-letter word called ROI, and return on investment has become, again, I'm sure most of us are hearing it from our senior leaders ourselves saying, what is a DEI's ROI? And the same question was asked 20 years back about human capital in the infant days when HR was still not seen as a strategic business partner. There were questions asked, what is the ROI? Hopefully we have come through that. Now it's a time of DEI. So I just want to place that in context before I share a few more thoughts on how I think one can go about working around these hurdles smartly as a DI professional. Before I do that, I must also tell you a little bit about my own orientation, preferences, and biases, which I will bring in to interpret this, because this is the situation as I see it. What I know are 2-3 things. I'm a poet, I'm a fiction writer, so I'm very sensitive to narratives. I'm always looking at what are the stories being told, what are the stories that are not being told, and trying to discern that. So that is one of the orientation I have. I'm an accountant who, I studied accounting economics and found that's not for me, which is when I switched to psychology, which was a terrible thing to do for my parents those days. I mean, they were horrified, saying, why would anyone move into psychology? But I do take a bit of that statistics orientation, which is also there in psychology. So it's narratives and it's data. Those are 2 things. Some of you who know me personally also know that I do have a practice of decades now with compassion-based meditation. I teach a certain method. So I do bring a little bit of that. And I have someone in my family who did suffer significantly with a mental health problem during COVID. So meditation plus proximity to a mental health challenge, that is another thing which I'm very sensitive to. So you will find these 3 things as biases, up to you to interpret if it is a good bias or a bad bias, but I want to tell you this is the way I look at it. Now, let's look at the word impact. And what kind of impact does inclusion make? And while we were thinking about what should be the theme for the keynote, I mean, one of the debate we had was, should we call impact through diversity and inclusion, or should we just call inclusion? And the reason I finally went with inclusion is that diversity on its own generally doesn't give too many benefits. You can increase all visible markers of diversity, more women, more marginalized communities, more sexual orientation, more generations in the workforce, in the marketplace, in the community. It doesn't give you anything. And that's because, as you would well know intuitively too, and research has borne it out, is if those diverse views and voices don't feel included, actually diversity could be counterproductive. You may have more conflicts, you may have more slow decision making, and so forth. So inclusion is a precondition if diversity has to give benefit. And which is why I thought inclusion is perhaps a bigger leverage. it's easier to bring in a diverse workforce. You can hire a few people. I'm not saying it's as easy as that, but it's easier. But if you declare victory with that, you lose the power of DEI. The real power of DEI, the real lubricant, if you will, I think is inclusion. Now, impact of, how do we know about impact that DEI makes on business or society? It's largely through what I would call social research methods. There is a lot of research being done to see what business outcomes or societal outcomes may be enabled by increasing inclusion. So I think all of us have read literature about various reports which say that generally a more diverse and inclusive workplace would be more innovative. It is likely to reduce the number of accidents on a shop floor. It is likely to drive collaboration. It is likely to increase empowerment, to increase employee engagement. And by increasing employee engagement, inclusion is likely to drive customer engagement in certain industries where the employees are facing customers. So these are certain research which is out there at a macro level. Is it likely to be useful in each of our companies, do you think? Just saying this research? No, because my experience is it's no point telling your CEO there is a McKinsey article which says that inclusion drives innovation, because the tendency is immediately to say, oh, that's a different industry or a different culture. And therefore, one of the key skills I think DEI professionals need to have is the ability to diagnose and over a period of time find relationship or causality between inclusion, and let's take workplace for now. So a more inclusive team over a period of time, can you demonstrate could be more innovative? It's possible. In Colgate-Palmolive, we found that the best R&D team defined as those which produce more patents were also the ones that generally tended to be higher on inclusion index. So we did a correlation coefficient first, then did a regression. So one of the essential tools at our disposal, I think, is some sort of mathematical or statistical analysis. So that is point number one. Second, on the other hand, and this I may be sounding like I'm contradicting myself, data, just using data, is also going to undermine our efforts. And that's because at the end of the day, inclusion is just a sentiment. Inclusion is in the head of somebody. If that employee or the consumer or the community stakeholders doesn't feel included, you don't have inclusion. So the proof of inclusion is a feeling. Now, this is where it gets really tricky. So I'm going to now ask a set of 3 questions, which I think is the heart of our job. And this goes back into one limitation that we have today, which is that whether it is neuroscience or the psychology or any of the behavioral science, they do not have the same level of maturity or sophistication yet of the physical sciences, because these sciences, neuroscience is a good example, is a young science. It's 3 decades old. And in neuroscience, we are still learning, for example, what drives biologically a condition which many mental health professionals call schizophrenia, as one example. We do not know, and the latest research still is uncertain as to what is causing it. And I'm just using one example. And most of our work, I would argue, is dependent on the maturity of the behavioral science. Because to make sense of people individually at a team level, at an organization level, at a societal level. We need to understand the brain, we need to understand the behavior, and that is really the heart of our work. And that is very hard because these sciences themselves are just evolving. They're getting better. They are rapidly improving, especially neuroscience with computing coming in. And because of that, the three questions I wanted to ask is, how well do we know why people feel included? That's question one. Anyone. It could be, do you know why? Like I asked myself, do I know why or what makes my daughter feel included, my employee feel included, my customer who enters Cathay Pacific feel included, and so on and so forth. The second question is, how well do I know what makes me included and what can make me included? Like asking myself. And the third question is, if you know these two questions, what makes somebody feel included? If I know what can make myself feel included, do we know what needs to be changed in terms of process, in terms of specific things that exist in the workplace? Any guesses on the answer for these three? This is not my answer, by the way. So I'm going to here rely on existing research because it's beyond my capability or bandwidth to do something like that. There is tons of research being done by Bain, a couple of others. My team in Swire do not get a chance to answer this because they know the answer, of course. Any guess? Question one. Yes.
I have a guess, which is we don't know. I don't know what makes people feel included, and the only way to know is by asking and by creating a space where that person can share.
Okay. Any other inputs?
We have someone from, we have Sonia from a virtual participant. She said they feel they have a voice.
Feel they have a voice. Okay. Okay. I don't know whether this is right or wrong. I will just parrot what the research, current state of research says. It says that, let's take my own example. And the analogy is happiness. Happiness studies, which is an applied branch of psychology, it has an element of economics, shows that human beings are notoriously poor at predicting what can make them happy. So we end up chasing all the wrong things. And throughout human history, we have done that because we do not know what makes us happy. And it seems it's somewhat similar when it comes to what makes us feel included, in the sense that we think something will make us included, but it is not necessarily so. And therefore, if you craft an intervention purely based on what you ask me about how I'll be included, you'll get some insight, but it may not be sufficient, is what research is saying. Now, that's a bit depressing because then you will say, what do I do then if you yourself do not know? Secondly, the drivers of what makes people included, when you do look at it outside in and see actual behavior of people, actual sentiment, doing various intervention, and then studying what seems to drive a sentiment of inclusion across cultures, across various workplaces, there is nothing universal that we have found which drives inclusion. So it may be training somewhere, it may be benefits somewhere, it may be a good boss somewhere else. The only 2 pointers, and I think this is important, are, and this goes back to how your brain feels when it is excluded. We know through fMRI brain scans that being excluded is almost like physical pain. It is really something which makes you, shrivel up. And therefore, you look at that and then say, okay, if it is so, what is it actually doing to you? So in some sense, psychologists say it's like feeling threatened. When I'm excluded, I feel threatened at some level, and it makes me uncomfortable. So inclusion necessarily, therefore, goes with a feeling of safety. That is one thing we know. So psychological safety is real. So everything that Amy Edmondson and all the others said about psychological safety, it's a precondition. On its own, it's not sufficient that just with that somebody would be included, but you could almost say you cannot have a person feeling included while being threatened or anxious or scared. So that's one. Second thing, which may be commonsensical, but what research is saying is you really need to know the identity or self-concept of the individual and what really matters to that person in terms of personal growth today. Like maybe for me, personal growth today means ability to explore one or two new skills or learn something new. For somebody else, it may be getting a promotion or whatever else it may be. So feeling included is the attention that you get from an organization or an environment which furthers what matters to your identity. And if for your identity, work-life balance is important, having a boss who pays attention, who listens, an organization that is sensitive, or if you are a certain demographic, a working mother, then it can make you feel included. So this is what we know today. And now the third question. So what do you really change? What are the levers for driving inclusion? If driving inclusion gives you good impact, how do you drive inclusion? So the earlier question gives you pointers, make people listen to, make people feel safe. That seems to be essential. It's almost like without that, you're not going to go any further. What we are trying out in Swire, and this is something that is being tried out elsewhere too, is ask what is a day in the life if you are an employee? What happens from the time you begin working either at home or in a physical workplace? Everything that touches me as an employee through my life cycle can change my feeling of inclusion. Experience before hiring, the hiring process itself, performance management, compensation, variable pay, succession planning, leadership development, leaders role modeling, your cafeteria, physical layout of your workplace, flexi, all that impacts you. And there is a concept in organization development or change management called congruence. You have to change everything that touches me for my feeling and behavior change to happen. And this is one classic error we can often make in HR or even as a DI practitioner. We may put all the effort in inclusive language for recruitment, but we don't reinforce that in another process, like a performance management. So deliberately engineering your talent processes, each and every one, and asking two questions. Is this practice, is this process driving inclusion? Is it driving equity? And asking employees, is it driving? It's not enough. You assuming, and this is where feedback is very helpful, along the way, and constantly tweaking is one way of going forward. The last thought I will leave, and then we can have questions. And I know Bijita did tell me we are very close to the time for speaking, is you have to, with every team, every cluster of human beings, the problems are different. And therefore, the diagnosis of what is a problem has to be customized. And you almost have to go in with any gap on inclusion or opportunity to increase inclusion either in the workplace or with customers or with community, I think with that same attitude of, I really don't know what the problem is, and I really do not know what is causing the gap. Maybe it is performance management system, maybe it is something else. So going with that attitude of I'm ignorant helps to some extent check tendency to assume this is a problem or that is a problem. So that you almost have to be like a doctor, I think. Go in and see what are the symptoms, what does those symptoms tell you, what is my provisional classification, and then go and look at it is where I would stop now and then ask if you have any questions. Oh, already. Okay. So the first question is inclusion impact cannot be seen in a short time. As from mental model to behavior change, it takes time, and also if people like to change. But how do we balance the short term versus long term? So this is a dilemma with any transformation, and it's a very often misused word, organizational transformation. But with culture change, it's true. It's like a child growing up sometimes. One has to be patient. It will not happen in the short term. In the short term, you can fix some very basic hygiene issues. So if you don't have a benefit or a policy, you can fix that. But any culture change, I think it takes time. And having steered many culture changes in my own career and having failed sometimes, having succeeded sometimes, I wish there was a faster way to accelerate it, but I would be lying if I say that. So my answer would be yes. In the short term, your credibility, I think, matters a lot as a DI professional. So your management or leadership or your stakeholders need to respect you as someone who is a thought leader, who's pragmatic, who understands the business, and who is offering suggestions that are relevant. I think that helps you by some time. What is the strategy of Swire for driving DI externally? Now, I'm interpreting this question as probably with the community. With the community, as of now, what we do is do a very, I would say, first level, or maybe in a few initiatives, impact assessment for all the philanthropy that we do. There are NGOs that we partner with, NGOs that we support, and a lot of those partnerships have stated aims. In some cases, the purpose of the partnership is driving social inclusion or reducing a certain inequality, which may be gender-based, it may be community-based. What we are now beginning to do is get into a discipline of social return on investment. We aren't there yet, but we are starting to do impact assessment a little bit like how we want to do it, like how a government would measure something like human development index, or how you would measure socioeconomic metrics to see whether the capacity of a community is going up. So borrowing from sociology, borrowing from developmental economics, and bringing those methods into DEI. Of course, it's not done in isolation. It has to be done with stakeholders. Again, here, it has to be tailor-made to a different circumstances. Okay, so
We still have some time. So yes, Steph.
Thank you so much.
All right, Steph, I'll give you the mic so the virtual participants can hear you.
Thank you so much, Ajay. I think that really sets the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. The question is really around data. I'm also a data person, but I've come across certain situations where the data comes in and it goes against DEI programming. For example, if an organization wants to run self-identification campaigns and realizes, oh, I only have one person who's gay or one person who's trans, now the programming stops because, well, it just impacts one person. What do we do? So what is your opinion on those kinds of circumstances?
Sure. So as a principle, I would say go where the data leads you. And that's because none of us can explain social phenomenon. Like I can't explain why I behave or what motivates me fully. Neither can I do that to a family member. So we all have this very large areas of ignorance about people. And therefore, often our expectations of how people would behave in this particular case is that a certain program should give certain results. It could be wrong. And if the data say it's wrong, my first provisional conclusion would be I'm wrong. It's a bit like a social scientist. So don't be too attached, because passion is good, but passion can be a barrier because then you stick with it. The second thing I would say, and you are a data person, so you know this, data sets are finite. The variables you measure are finite. When you add variables, expand the data set longitudinally, you may see different trends and different patterns. So like science, every conclusion is provisional until it's proven wrong. Newton was right until Einstein came and proved him wrong, something like that. The last bit I would mention is it's not about the one person is important. So I don't think interventions necessarily need to affect large quantities because it's also symbolic. You are really emphasizing, if the organizational philosophy I'm assuming is in tune with that, you're emphasizing that one person does matter, right? And today it's that one person. We don't know how many are in the closet and if there are others who want to come in, etc. Okay. Yeah, it's a complex question, which perhaps difficult to answer. The other thing I would say is, see, I've changed what I understood as data. So data is not just numbers. So social psychologists, for example, when they observe a room of people interacting, take notes, and for them, the notes, observations, who is interacting with whom, sociogram, how is somebody sitting, all that is data. When you do ethnographic studies with marginalized communities, it's the same. Even the language used, the silence, all that is data, which a very good leader or HR practitioner knows it in the gut because you sense something is wrong and you have to bring that into. So I would say data is broader than hard data. It's also soft observations. After seeing all of it and having tried to become accurate using data science and psychology and having failed many times, I would say I still suspect interpreting data is more of an art than a science. Okay, so that's where I would leave it for now.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Ajay. We have one more virtual question. I think we just have time for that last question.
Okay. There are two or three, but if I were to pick up the greatest internal challenge is because Swire, like most organizations, had DEI for a while and had invested in DEI for a while. People have defined DEI with a certain boundary. So DEI work means this. It means doing a panel discussion on International Women's Day or doing a training on inclusive leadership, etc., etc. And the moment the conversation goes into how is inclusion driving passenger satisfaction in Cathay, as an example, or how is it affecting customer satisfaction in Upper House, which is a Swire hotel, it takes a while for somebody to come around and say, what has that got to do with DEI? So it's expanding that and taking DEI from not a discipline which is activity based. It's not about the activities we do. It's about the outcomes we enable. And explaining that in a very granular way, practically, so I feel like I'm a salesman, right, going ahead, advocating it, right? But not advocating with passion, because advocating with passion can backfire for someone who's not passionate. So you're converting people, you're bringing people around, telling what is the latest research saying, finding what's in it for them. How is DEI going to help you with your sale, with your customer, etc. Okay, so that can be hard, and of course I'm not doing it alone. I'm lucky to have a wonderful bunch of people working with me in the DI team and in the HR team. Okay, but that's the biggest challenge, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajay. Any last question? Burning question? Yes. We'll take one more.
Yeah, as to the doctor diagnose metaphor you just mentioned, I would like to ask, is there any one specific example where you diagnose a symptom and what kind of approaches you've done to make the situation better?
Yeah, and we have some Swire people, a couple of them in the room. So we just did what I would call a very big medical checkup, to just use that metaphor. We partnered with one of the consultants and we did a comprehensive DEI belonging maturity assessment for 5 of our companies: Cathay Pacific, Swire Coca-Cola, Swire Properties, HECO, and Ali is from HECO, and Swire Hotels. It took us 5 to 6 months where we looked at everything that touches the employee, every process, every practice, every policy which exists. We also looked at what is missing, interviewed many leaders and asked them, where do you think the maturity is? What is missing? What would you do? And we came with this calibration of what are we good at? What are we not good at? What are the symptoms that need addressing? And we are now designing a roadmap, and we are finding the roadmap is different. Not surprising, different for HECO, different for Cathay, different for Swire Coca-Cola, Chinese mainland, different for Hong Kong, because the symptoms, sometimes even when the symptoms are the same, the pathogen that causes the symptom isn't the same. So it requires a different prognosis. Okay, so that is a big work we have done, I would say, in the last 6 months. Now, you could look at it and say it's not really work, it's foundation, but at least we feel like we know what we need to tweak. So that is perhaps, I don't know, Ali, if there's anything you want to add on, or would that be a fair summary, or Mia? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ajay, for such a thought-provoking keynote. We have a little something for you.
Great.